All right. Last week we finished verse 17 of our notes of 1 Peter chapter 3. We're moving on to verse 18. Lord willing, the goal is to get through the end of the chapter this morning. Chapter 4 notes are on the back table, as well as the questions for verses 1 through 6 of chapter 4 back there on the back table. So I'm going to adjust a little bit to try to add maybe an extra verse or two per week to try to catch up just a little bit from kind of being we're just behind about one class. So maybe we can make that up a little bit. Okay, so after Peter has been encouraging the saints, reminding them of the need for them to be willing to suffer for the cause of Christ, and yet even during the course of persecution to still be prepared to preach the gospel, to talk to people, to have that state of mind that they're not afraid of the persecution to the point that they shut themselves up and they don't talk to people about the gospel. He brings up Jesus in verse 18, and he utilizes the example of Jesus as being the example of suffering. And of course, obviously, there's many examples that could be pointed to, the prophets and certainly all those individuals of faith that the Hebrew writer mentions. But Peter brings up Jesus for a very specific reason. And says in verse 18, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit." So instead of utilizing examples of past faithful people who have suffered even unto death, notice how verse 18 obviously being connected to verse 17, "For Christ also suffered." Now, what's the immediate conclusion of application that we might draw from verse 18? Given the state that the saints are in to whom Peter's writing, these brethren who are going through persecution, when he says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins," so then what's the obvious application that we might take away from that?
If you stop right there, he went through what they're going through.
Okay. All right. So if you stop right there at verse 18, you might conclude that Peter's application here is really the fact that Jesus was willing to be persecuted even to death. Therefore, these saints should be willing to, and certainly we should be willing to. But is that only, certainly that application exists, that sure. But is that really what Peter's point is? Notice he says in verse 18, "the just for the unjust." Who's the just and who's the unjust?
He is the just.
Okay. He was the just. We were the unjust. Okay, all of us were. He suffered once for sin, even though he was sinless. He didn't deserve what he was dealing with, and yet he was willing to suffer it for our sakes, for the sakes of others, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit. So if Peter's point isn't simply just that Jesus was willing to die, therefore you should be willing to die too, then what is his point of bringing up the example of Jesus? Why does he discuss this, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive? What does he mean he was made alive by the Spirit?
Nobody else could do that for us. And, the Spirit, has given the knowledge, the everything, he's the comforter that was sent. And, we wouldn't have the Spirit if Christ hadn't been put to death as well.
Okay. Notice the two main aspects to what Peter's bringing up here. First, there is the perspective. The reminder of the perspective that the saints should have. That Jesus, yes, he was put to death in the flesh. But is that really what matters? No, because what did God do? He raised him from the dead. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that he became the first fruits of them that slept. Okay, he was the first one to be risen, never to die again. Which then suggests, kind of the inference that we gain here, and the saints are meant to gain here from what Peter's point here is that in addition to the proper perspective that the saints should have regarding the flesh versus the spirit, what do they look forward to? Yeah, being raised from the dead just as Jesus was raised from the dead. And really, it's interesting because if you stop at verse 18 and then you jump to verse 22, okay, leave verse 19 through 21 kind of on its own because it's almost a bracketed thought. You jump from verse 18 where he was put to death in the flesh but made alive by the Spirit, verse 22, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him. So it's as if this exaltation of the fact that Jesus, in fulfilling the Father's will, what did the Father then do for him? He exalted him. He exalted him. He received the promise that the Father had made to him. Okay, and God was faithful to bring about the fulfillment of that promise. So in a lot of ways, when you consider verse 18 and then verse 22, just on their own, it's as if Peter's reminding the saints, listen, there may be those who think to themselves, why should I be willing to suffer? I mean, well, why should I do that? Christ has made me alive in the Spirit by being baptized, to have my sins washed away, and I am a citizen in the kingdom of God. I'm a child of God. Why should we suffer? Why should we be treated as if, especially if we don't deserve it? Because isn't that kind of what the context was earlier? You know, suffering for doing that which is good. All right, why should we suffer for doing good? That's not fair. So who's the ultimate example of yielding to unfairness of man? Jesus is. Yes, sir.
You reference back to verse 17 where you use the word better. That comes out so often in the book of Hebrews.
Yeah.
And here it is not as often used or referenced, but that's what there's something better. And the
Right.
culmination, 18 through 22, seen in Christ, what God did for him.
Right. And you know, the human nature, and we've talked a little bit about this already, because has Peter really dealt with the sacrifice of Jesus quite a bit? And not so much the sacrifice of Jesus, but Jesus' character in the midst of that persecution. He has really hammered home the mind of Jesus throughout that entire process. Okay, and of course it's very applicable for the saints to whom he's writing, obviously, because they're going through similar situations. But Peter wants to bring out the fact that, no, this isn't according to nature. Okay, this isn't human nature to simply yield to persecution because of your faith. Yet because Jesus was willing to do so, and he was the only just one, and he died for all of us, then we should be able to fight our natural instincts, our human instincts, and be willing to suffer because others aren't fair. Okay, if we're suffering, especially if we're suffering for what is good, for what is right, we're suffering because of our faith, then that's okay. And really what Peter wants to impress upon these brethren is that it's okay to suffer and to be put to death for your faith. That's all right. Jesus did it, and look what he accomplished. And look what the Father did for him. Well, we have a promise from the Father also. And just as much as Jesus was a recipient of the promise from the Father, so we will be as well. Thoughts through verse 18.
Jesus' whole time on this earth was to do the will of the Father, and that's what we need to keep focused on too.
That's that perspective.
Right.
It goes back to that. And sometimes, and let's take persecution, the specific concept of persecution out of it. And let's look at it just as trials. Okay? Obviously, persecution would be categorized as a trial. But aside from the specific context that the saints are dealing with that Peter writes about, issues of life can be a trial, can't they? And temptations are trials. Okay, issues sometimes we have in our families can be trials. issues at jobs and at school. Are there countless distractions that we face every day? Imagine if Jesus had been distracted, if only for a little while, during the course of his 33 years as a human. We know that in the course of those years, did he ever sin even once? Not once. Had he been distracted for a period of time, not really thinking about where he was, not being circumspect, not thinking about the will of the Father, that possibility would have existed for him to sin. But he didn't allow that to happen. He remained focused on what his mission was, on what his job was, what God had told him to, his Father had told him to do. And of course that speaks to the perspective, obviously, that the saints need to have, in that since we have become Christians and we seek to be Christ-like, we need to have that same perspective. That even though stuff happens in life, don't allow that to distract us to the point that we lose sight of what it is we're trying to obtain, which is obviously resurrection unto life. Anything else through verse 18? All right. So, going to, and this kind of deals quite a bit with both question 1 and question 7 on our question page. What is the significance of using the example of Jesus' suffering, and how does Peter's analogies continue to relate to this example? And of course, the analogies that I'm referencing are earlier analogies that he describes in these different situations, these different responsibilities that these brethren face, and certainly the specific example of Jesus being willing to suffer contrary to human nature. That needs to be applied to us as well, and that's why he brings that up. And so that's question 1. And question 7 is, why does Peter point out that Jesus has ascended to heaven and has now been placed in authority over all things? We kind of dealt with, and I figure I'll jump to question 7 because we already kind of talked about verse 22 a little bit. Obviously, there's that promise of eternal life. There's that exaltation that we're all looking forward to for the Father giving to us as he's promised. But what about the fact that Peter adds here angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him? What about that statement from Peter would provide saints who are suffering persecution hope? Remember what Jesus said to his disciples, "In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer." What else did he say? "For I have overcome the world." Okay. And remember, Jesus said that before he had even been sacrificed. Okay. It was as if in his mind, this was accomplished, this was done, because he was so determined to make sure he fulfilled the Father's will. So in that sense, that's why he said, "I have overcome the world." And that promise of being exalted above all authority was going to be his. That being the case, how does that help the saints then, as they're dealing with persecution?
Know that this persecution, this life isn't the end of it. And
Okay.
better is coming.
And there's a higher authority, right? Remember, a lot of this almost all of this persecution, if it wasn't actually encouraged by the governments, from the time of these saints all the way through the first couple hundred years AD, it certainly was sanctioned by Rome and certainly by the Sanhedrin and so forth. And so the idea that I'm suffering, even though I'm doing what's right, I'm not guilty of breaking any proper laws, and yet my government is either seeking me out to persecute me or sanctioning the persecution of those like me. The fact that there is an authority that is above all of them, okay, that has allowed man to have the authority that he has, that gives me an understanding, a reminder that, you know what, man cannot cause any delay to the plan of God. It can't disrupt his plans. And even if man continues to persecute Christians, is that simply going to ultimately further the plan of God? which we know it did in Acts chapter 8, yeah, it's only going to further the spread of the gospel. That's just how it works. And so that understanding that there is a higher authority, that Jesus is above all things, that ultimately even, and this is what Revelation is really all about, is that even those in power, such as the Roman Empire, they will answer for the things that they have done. They won't get away with it. God is mindful of all those who suffer for his name's sake. All right, anything through questions 1 or 7? And like I said, verses 19 through 21, it's not that there isn't a continuation of thought here, but it's almost as if this is kind of a bracketed thought. Verse 18 flows perfectly into verse 22. And so when we start in verse 19, it's as if Peter, he doesn't necessarily jump tracks or anything, but he delves into a specific point that he wants to make. So starting in verse 19, notice, let's start verse 18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit. By whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through water. Question 2 of our question sheet. Who preached to the spirits? By whom? What prison? And who are the spirits? Because this confuses a lot of people. Okay, I mean, there are some, especially on the heels of, this being on the heels of what he's going to say in chapter 4, there are those who reference purgatory, verses 5 and 6, especially of chapter 4, and then they link it here, the idea of purgatory being suggested.
So I may be totally missing this, but my thought in reading it was when he went and preached to the spirits in prison, he is the spirit, but preaching to spirits in prison to sin, and those spirits are, our souls. And through the word we learn, we know what we have to do, we have the gift of the Spirit. Yeah.
Okay, so by whom, if we're going to talk about who the whom is, who the whom is, it's the Spirit, right? That through the Spirit, something's being taught. Okay, that much we've established. The he went and preached. Who's the he?
Usually capital H means Jesus.
Obviously in the Greek it's not capitalized, but yes, usually capital H means Jesus, okay, or God, or the Father, or the Spirit himself. Okay, but notice we've got by whom being the Spirit, he went and preached. Okay, notice, and of course, given the situation of verse 18, this would suggest that this is Jesus, okay, or God in general, at the very least, and preached to the spirits in prison. These spirits in prison, we're talking about souls, as Debbie mentioned. Okay, these are souls. In what kind of prison do they exist? Literal prison?
Spiritual prison.
Okay, so they're lost souls. They're individuals who need to know something.
Those who are slaves to sin.
Okay, slaves to sin. Now notice verse 20. Who formerly were disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah. So, Peter's describing a situation in which individuals were taught something they needed to hear because they were lost. And then he describes the setting for which he's establishing what this is all about, verse 20. What was the scenario? What's the specific, and of course, the teaching of what people need to hear? You could focus on any point in time by anybody teaching the gospel. But what event or what time period does Peter focus in on? The days of Noah. The days of Noah. And isn't it interesting, especially when you read 2 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 5, what does Peter call Noah? Preacher of righteousness. I suggest to you that what's being referred to in verse 19 and verse 20 is the fact that through the Spirit was taught the warnings for that 100-some years that Noah was building that ark regarding the coming of this judgment of God. In that case, it was a flood. That during that period of time, Noah's warning people. He's trying to talk to people and tell them about the coming condemnation that's awaiting them. And that through the Spirit, that message was being provided to these individuals. They were disobedient, verse 20. The formerly isn't a reference to it's not an adjective describing the fact that now they are. He's using the phrase formerly to reference time past. And a lot of times that throws people. They read that they were formerly, so we're talking about people somehow who were saved, but we're not talking about Noah and his family? No, these are people, he's talking about in former times. These individuals were disobedient, even though the gospel was being preached to them. Everybody follow me? Yes, sir.
So another perspective on that might be that the spirits in prison could be a reference to humanity in general.
Yep.
All of the people that God has created could be what is referred to as the spirits in prison.
Well, from the perspective that all man has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and all have needed the message of what we need to do to be right in the sight of God, that certainly applies. But it's interesting that Peter, he focuses in on that time period before the flood. And he focuses on the divine long-suffering and how that divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah. To what end? There's two reasons why God waited. What's one obvious reason? To save Noah, okay? For the ark needed to be built, and it took 100 years to do so. What's the second reason? Maybe.
To wait for anybody else to be saved.
Somebody might listen. We know they didn't, but maybe somebody will. Now, before we get to verse 21, what possible purpose could any of verse 19 and 20 have within the context of the persecution and of Christ's example? What purpose does that have for these saints? Why does Peter talk about this? Because he could have just talked about baptism, verse 21, on its own. He didn't have to somehow link it to the flood and spirits in prison.
It's not the first time God has attempted to rescue the world.
Okay. It's not the first time God has attempted to rescue the world, nor is it the first time that he has used the righteous to reach out to the unrighteous. Right? What did he refer to Jesus as being, verse 18? The just reaching out to whom? The unjust. Just as in the days of Noah, the just were not only an example, but by word as well, were reaching out to the unjust. So how does that then apply to the brethren? Even by persecution, and yet they're holding to their faith, what are they in essence doing? They're teaching. They may not, and that's what happens if you lose perspective. You might lose perspective of the fact that you're setting an example. This is part of the reason why verse 15, be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. Remember we talked before about what might spur a person to ask about the hope that is in them. Why are you willing to suffer? Why not just deny him and get this over with? You don't have to suffer anymore. Those who are aware of the suffering and the persecution that these saints are going through, it's so out of sync with human nature that that's going to stand out like a sore thumb. Obviously, these individuals are convicted to go through something like this. Well, Noah, I don't know what all Noah had to deal with in terms of backlash from the people around him, but I can imagine, given the fact that to that period of time it had not at least flooded, certainly not on the scale that is being described. And there's even some suggestion that given the way things were before the flood, it may not have even rained before. That being the case, Noah, whatever he had to deal with in terms of backlash from people around him, still continued to be a beacon of hope. That maybe someone would heed and listen to the message. Well, that same example exists among Christians. Most especially, when we're willing to endure persecution for doing what's right. That message can be heard. And you may not think about it. But that's what, this is part of the thread of thought that Peter's establishing. He uses Christ's example. He uses Noah's example. He words it in a way that you could kind of lose track. But notice where he doesn't bring out Noah specifically. Who does he bring out? People in the days of Noah being preached to by whom? He could have easily mentioned Noah. But who is it that's preaching, or that did preach to them? It was God. It was God who was preaching in the Spirit through Noah about the need for people to hear and obey what God says. They didn't listen. And that's why in verse 20, when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, he waited, gave Noah the time he needed to build the ark, gave people time to listen and heed the words of Noah. Nobody did, except for, obviously, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. And then he says, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. All right, so answering question 2. And for question 2, obviously, there's like 5 parts to it. But who preached to the spirits? In general, God did. Okay, but this is part of the reason why I included 2 Peter 2, verse 5. God preached through the Spirit. But obviously, Noah being called a preacher of righteousness, obviously it's coming out of Noah's physical mouth. But it was the message that had been given to him through the Spirit from God. Okay, and if you want to be even more specific, from Jesus, we know that Jesus played a role, even in the Old Testament. Okay, we know that rock, okay, that gave forth water, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, that rock was Christ. Okay, so there was a role there. He wasn't physically on the earth, but it wasn't that Jesus didn't exist. He did. So what prison? The prison, obviously, of sin. Okay, that it's not a physical prison, it's a spiritual one. And then the spirits were these individuals who were alive, who were facing judgment. And yet these righteous were able to overcome that generation of sin and condemnation because they were righteous. Now, isn't it interesting that because these 8 souls were saved, and yet they were saved through the ark? No, don't shake your head. Were they saved through the ark? Did the ark save them from being drowned? Yeah, the ark saved them, right? But is that what Peter says?
Saved by water.
Saved by... How were they saved by? Water was the threat. Water was the danger. Huh? Sorry? Okay, so in essence, water, in the case of the flood, separated quite literally the just from the unjust, didn't it? Just as Jesus suffered the just for the unjust, water separated Noah and his family from a generation of sin and being defiled. Notice he says that they were saved through water, verse 21. There is an antitype which now saves us. Pam, I saw your hand a second ago.
Well, it's just like the separation of life and just from just in Christ is God has attached work. Because he was going to destroy everything.
Yeah.
All things, everything.
Yeah.
But because of Noah, he protects Noah.
Yeah.
And the animals.
That's right. That's right.
It's a reset.
Well, and imagine and it's hard to kind of wrap our head around. I mean, we don't know what the total population of the earth was at the time of the flood. But imagine only, and not just having 8 people who were the only ones God considered righteous, but it being you, your wife, your 3 sons, and your 3 daughters-in-law. That out of all the people who lived, whether it was thousands or millions, who out of all those people, you were the only 8 people that God deemed righteous. Imagine that. And then, to a certain extent, it's a little bit mirrored with Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, isn't it? Okay, kind of somewhat mirrored, because it was only Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters, which obviously those 3 weren't entirely very faithful people. But those 4 people, out of 2 cities plus all the cities of the plain, were the only righteous people that God was willing to save. And it goes to show how the temptation might be to feel so alone and to feel so overwhelmed with sin and with influence. And yet, Noah remained faithful. Okay? And minus some bad choices, Lot was faithful. Okay? So there are tons of examples where God takes action, and in this case he brings up Noah and the flood. He takes action to separate the righteous from the unrighteous. And there's a specific reason he's doing this. Yes, sir?
So I think that the one of the points being made here is that sin will be destroyed. All sin
Sure.
is going to be destroyed.
Oh.
And the difference between, for example, Noah and his family and everybody else was that they were willing to leave that sin behind
Yep.
and be saved from the perverse generation through the water.
Yep,
And
that's
when
true.
we're baptized, we have to be willing to leave that sin behind. We have to confess. We have to repent.
Yep.
We have to turn away from that sin. If we're not willing to do that, then we can't be saved.
Yep. Yeah, that certainly is a parallel to Noah and his family having to leave that entire world that they knew at the time behind. Any friendships they may have formed, leave all that behind, and start all over again. A lot of times people refer to Adam and Eve, and that's true. Yes, that's how we started, was Adam and Eve. But really, technically, we started over with Noah and the other 7. Okay, and by that time, it was, in terms of children, I don't know if Noah and his wife had any more children after that, but certainly his 3 sons and daughters-in-law did. But the idea that separation of, I say separation, rephrase that, the distinguishing of righteous from unrighteous was made by water there. That's what saved them from a perverse generation. And so when he gets to baptism, in essence what Peter's describing is not that the flood happened for this purpose necessarily, in the sense for baptism, but it served as a shadow of things to come, as the Hebrew writer would say. Question 3, how were 8 souls saved by water? Obviously, the distinguishing between righteous and unrighteous. God saved those 8 souls from a generation of sin. And yes, Hebrews 11, verse 7, there's the implication there by the Hebrew writer that yes, they were saved through the ark. They were saved from drowning. That was a physical aspect from which they were saved. The water, from a physical perspective, was a threat. It was a danger. However, from a spiritual perspective, that water was how they were saved. All right? So leading into question 4. Yes, sir?
Well, the water literally washed this sin away.
They literally washed all the people of sin away. Didn't it? Yeah, it sure did. Yeah.
There is a physical aspect of it.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Anything else to question 3? So then moving into question 4, what does antitype mean and how are the flood and baptism related? So this is where there is an antitype which now saves us. So there's type and antitype. Okay? If I were to say that so-and-so's vehicle, it's a type of SUV. Okay? It's a type of this, or it's a type of this particular plant is a type of flower or whatever. Okay, what are you referencing and comparing? What's the type and the antitype? The clearest way that I've ever heard it explained is type on a typewriter the old-fashioned way. When you had the ink ribbon, okay, and at least the old-fashioned typewriter that I had, my grandmother gave me, had black and red. That was the only colors I had. Okay, but you had to stick the ribbon in, and then you had these metal arms that every time you hit the letter, this arm would swing forward, and between the paper and that imprint, it would hit that ribbon and imprint the letter on the page. Well, we call it a typewriter because it imprinted, what was imprinted on the paper was the type. Okay? This is what was imprinted there. But was it the substance of what created the type? No. Okay, it was simply what you could see. But rather there was something more substantial behind it that was making that impression. Okay? This is the similar concept of what Peter's describing here when he says there is an antitype which now saves us. So between baptism and the flood, which is the type and which is the antitype? The flood would be the antitype, the type, whereas baptism is the antitype. Okay, which means that the flood is representative of something deeper. Okay, and in this case, as Peter's describing all of this, he's using the flood almost as representative of something else. And that's why we're talking about this distinguishing nature that the water served to separate the just from the unjust. Well, isn't it interesting that in verse 21, when he says, we are also saved via the conduit of water. And in this case, it's not a flood. In this case, it's a choice to be immersed, okay, by water. And of course, the prevailing power behind that, obviously, is the obedience associated with it. The water itself isn't what saves. It's the obedience to God being baptized. All right, so anything through that first half of verse 21?
Sometimes the Bible uses shadow
Yeah.
as a similar way of describing
Yep.
the original versus the shadow of it.
Yeah, the Hebrew writer talks about the shadows of things to come regarding the old law and the tabernacle in referencing to the things that were actually in heaven. Okay, and how that these things on the earth were simply representative of the things that existed in heaven. And it's the same concept in the sense that the flood served that purpose, but the ultimate salvation doesn't come through a flood, and it doesn't even come through water, literally. It comes through the blood of Jesus. Okay, and that is that reference. That is that ultimate kind of peeling away the layers, so to speak, that Peter is emphasizing here. But is Peter dealing with baptism just for baptism's sake? I mean, what's the purpose, even with verse 20? Okay, making the case that even still, individuals suffering persecution, just as Noah was willing to go through that 100 years building that ark and try to talk to people, that we can do the same thing. What purpose does verse 21 have in the context? What is it about? Because is he writing to people who are not baptized or those who are baptized? So he's not having to convince them that they need to become baptized, is he? So then he's telling them something about their current state. Not that they need to be baptized, but rather they need to understand this aspect about their state because they have been baptized. So what's his point?
Resurrection. I mean, that ultimately getting to heaven.
Okay. So when he says, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, stop. It's not a... So incidentally, the irony here is that sometimes people read through this, they think sometimes maybe some Holy Spirit baptism or some other type of baptism. Term baptism, obviously, it means immersion, right? But the inference that we're to take from this, it's not the removal of the filth of the flesh. What type of scenario would you remove the filth of the flesh? In a bath. And a bath involves water, cleansing, okay? So the carrying of that idea then is that this process, baptism, has nothing to do with a bath in which you wash the physical filth away, but instead it washes what type of filth? Spiritual filth, sin away. Okay? And it's not figurative water. And that's kind of the emphasis here, is that this is literal water that Peter's talking about. That's what baptism is. But it has nothing to do with a bath. It has everything to do with the Spirit. It is the answer of a good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if he's talking to people who are suffering in the flesh, who need to be reminded to maintain perspective, he brings to their mind or their remembrance the example of Jesus. He brings to their remembrance the example of how that God has always not only been with his people, but he has always made the means by which those who are faithful to him can be saved. Thus, Noah and the other 7 souls. That being the case, what is verse 21 meant to do in the mind of the saints to whom Peter's writing? If it's not meant to convince me to be baptized because I already am, then what is it? Sorry?
Remain faithful, I mean, continue to remember why you were baptized and what your ultimate goal is. I mean, this is our avenue to, being resurrected with Jesus.
Okay. So just as Noah, I keep wanting to say Abraham. Forgive me if I say Abraham. Noah and the 7 were saved through water. Okay. Have we already been saved through water as well? Yeah. Okay. Was that water, did it save us from a generation of sin? Did it set us apart? It cleansed us not of the physical filth, but of the spiritual filth. That being the case, then what is the call for these saints to do? In addition to being faithful, obviously, that's certainly important that they remain faithful, that they maintain perspective, but in the context of persecution, what then does verse 21 equip them with? Huh?
It's worth it.
Okay, it's worth it.
Worth the persecution.
Yeah, it's worth the persecution, sure.
Jesus did what he said, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. For he looked ahead to help him endure the cross, for the joy that was set before him. He suffered the shame and the persecution on the cross.
Right. And certainly associated with that is the example then that you even though you're being persecuted and you may not be saved from persecution, does it really matter?
You need to stay clean and continue having that good conscience toward God.
Stay clean. Stay clean is the emphasis. Because you're being persecuted, that temptation to yield may be there, but the message from Peter to these saints is stay clean. You have been washed. You were saved through water because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So stay clean. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with verse 21 and 22 next week, and then we'll get into chapter 4. Again, those notes are on the back table. Thank you, everybody.